Okay, so we kind of pulled a fast one in part 1, teasing the Moscow Mule and delivering the Russian cocktail instead. But our story got too intense, with Nazis and brutal dictators running amok. So we promise that in Vodka and Victory Part 2, you'll learn the exciting conclusion to our epic tale and absolutely, positively learn how to make a Moscow Mule. Find out on this upcoming episode of Happy Hour History. So in part 1, we saw how Hitler's Nazi Germany began its quest to dominate the world, and how Russia, a traditional enemy of Germany, suddenly became its frenemy. This was because the Soviet dictator Stalin had killed most of his own army officers in a fit of paranoia. Together, these two dictators carved up Eastern Europe, and then Hitler took over most of Western Europe. But their star-crossed love affair couldn't last because Hitler hated communists and considered Russians subhuman. So in 1941, he launched a sneak attack that drove deep into the Soviet Union toward Moscow. Back in the USA, average folks were definitely not interested in fighting another European war, and also not too keen about vodka. Despite this, President Roosevelt needed Stalin as an ally, so he turned the US into the arsenal of democracy, also known as the world's greatest weapons manufacturer. And he gave arms to England and then Russia. World War II became the Battle of the Factories. By late 1941, the Germans were at the gates of Moscow due to a series of military blunders by Stalin. And to make matters worse, the Japanese had massed troops on Russia's Siberian border, ready to strike if Moscow fell. With the fate of the USSR hanging in the balance, what did the fearsome Stalin do? He retreated to his private country home and sat around muttering to himself. This was not good.
Feel like I'll drink to that.
Oh, gee, and I feel fine.
As the Germans crept closer every day, Stalin remained in his funk, and the situation grew more desperate. Then he did the one thing that always seemed to cheer him up. He killed a bunch of his own people. Stalin declared martial law and ordered his secret police to kill looters, people out past curfew, or anyone judged to be a spy. Speaking of spies, Stalin finally got some good news from his own super spy. Richard Sorge was a Hemingway-esque, hard-drinking libertine who posed as a German journalist at the Nazi embassy in Tokyo. During his short time there, it was estimated that he was lovers with over 30 women, including the wife of his friend, the ambassador, and both the wife and mistress of the German foreign secretary. Damn, those must have been some crazy embassy parties. Sorge used his outwardly frivolous playboy image to divert suspicion, and he had an amazing gift for gaining the confidence of both German and Japanese officials. Sorge discovered that Japanese troops stationed in wintry Siberia had just been supplied with new uniforms that included shorts. That meant that most of these troops were soon moving south, and Stalin could safely divert his Siberian troops to the defense of Moscow. You see, Japan had decided upon a different target.
Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy.
Back in Russia, the Germans continued their drive to the outskirts of Moscow. But now, a revitalized Stalin, who was determined to fight for his capital, rallied his people through a series of radio addresses. He also created citizen brigades, made up mostly of women, who went to work building up defensive systems and tank barriers. Along with the thousands of winter-trained Siberian soldiers, a new ally joined the fight for Moscow: the weather. A blizzard hit the blitzkrieg.
So, who is the genius now?
As the worst winter weather in years conspired to bring the German offensive to a near halt. Not only were the ill-clothed troops sent by the thousands to the hospital or their deaths, but German tanks, trucks, weapons, and horses refused to work in the bitter cold. Despite the weather, By the start of December, some Nazi units moved close enough to Moscow that they could see the spires of the Kremlin. The Germans were determined to take the city, convinced that the bulk of the Russian army had already been destroyed. Then on December 5th, 1941, the Red Army launched a major counterattack that shocked the Nazis and knocked them back. The once invincible German army suffered its first major defeat. The Russian counteroffensive saved Moscow. To celebrate, Stalin decided it was time to make another tragic military blunder. He ignored the advice of his generals and ordered a massive attack across the entire Russian front, convinced that he could push the Germans all the way back to Berlin. It was madness, but no one argues with Stalin and lives, so thousands more common Russian soldiers died for his vanity. I want to take a moment to move beyond the maps and the strategies to talk about the average Russian soldier, whose efforts ultimately helped win the war. It's also important to recognize that hundreds of thousands of women served in the Red Army. It must have been truly horrifying to be a soldier in Stalin's army. Unlike American troops, they were not recognized as individuals whose lives meant anything. Here's an example. The Soviets cleared minefields by marching their troops straight through them. In addition, many Soviet army troops were poorly trained and ill-equipped, often given only one weapon per 2 or more soldiers. Once your comrade was shot, you picked up the weapon and went on. Stalin also refused to let his troops surrender or retreat. His secret police, the NKVD, later known as the KGB, formed special blocking units. They would gun down any Russian troops who retreated from a battle, even if the situation was clearly hopeless. Those many thousands who did surrender were often killed or forced into slave labor by the Nazis. And if they managed to escape, Stalin suspected them of being spies or contaminated with foreign ideas, so he would have them imprisoned, or more often, shot. Taking all this into account, it's easy to see why, even when they were winning battles, 3 times as many Russian soldiers died for every German that perished. Contrast that with American troops, whose military leaders were accountable to an elected civilian government. The American people simply would not have tolerated such unjustifiable losses on the battlefield. To the Russian soldiers and people, Zad Zadrovi. The fighting around Moscow would continue till the spring of 1942, when the battle was officially declared over. In total, 1.5 million men would perish by its end. To add some perspective, the total number of U.S. soldiers who died in the entire war was just over 400,000. Now that's dreadful, and no small sum. But when you compare that to the 11 million Russian soldiers who died, and somewhere between 7 and 20 million civilians, well, you see my point. Although Moscow was no longer threatened, the battle for Russia was far from over. In 1942, the Germans redirected their forces to the oil-rich regions of southern Russia, where they would again sweep across the land with even more success until they ended up in a place called Stalingrad. That battle would cost thousands more Russian lives, but it would finally put an end to Germany's expansion into Russia. It is now considered the turning point in World War II, which, by the way, the Russians refer to as the Great Patriotic War, not World War II. And it's in 1942 where a major point of contention emerged between the Allies. Stalin was urging the United States and Britain to launch a second front in France, ASAP, to take the pressure off his troops. But although U.S. officials were originally gung-ho for the idea, they soon realized that such an invasion would be a disaster, unnecessarily killing thousands of our inexperienced troops. So instead, together with the British, they landed a smaller force in oil-rich North Africa, and from there steadily moved up into Italy in 1943. As a result, the Russians took on the bulk of the German forces until D-Day 1944. So the Russians, who argue that they won World War II, do have some legit bragging rights. So what would happen to these two maniacal monsters of history, who were responsible for killing more people than anyone else, until a few years later when this guy came along? In 1943, the Red Army would begin forcing the Nazis back, eventually into Germany. Then, following D-Day, The Western Allies would push across France, Belgium, and into Western Germany. By April 1945, the Russians had surrounded Berlin. Hitler, who was in a bunker deep underneath the city, decided it was time to get married. To celebrate, he shot himself as his new bride swallowed poison. Stalin, he fared better, taking over much of Eastern Europe and running it with the same terror tactics he perfected until the year 1953, where, in his private room, Stalin suffered a stroke and collapsed onto the floor. In a slight bit of karmic payback, he would lay all alone, slowly dying in a pool of his own urine. He suffered alone because everyone around him were too terrified to enter the room, fearing that he would become enraged and order their instant death. So why does any of this matter? Well, here's a few things. The Battle of Moscow impacted every other battle afterward, including the fate of the brave young soldiers who parachuted into France. After Moscow, Hitler decided that he alone would make all the important military decisions. Hitler slept through the D-Day invasion, declining to be woken because he decided, against the advice of his generals, that it was a diversionary attack. So Hitler refused to use his sizable tank forces to counterattack. Had he done so, history might have turned out a bit differently. Not long after World War II, Russia went from being an ally to America's greatest foe. The Cold War with the Soviets, which contained the very real threat of nuclear annihilation, lasted decades.
No matter where they go or what they do, they always try to remember what to do if the atom bomb explodes right then. It's a bomb, duck and cover.
And today, Russia continues to influence world events. Its president/dictator Vladimir Putin was a high-ranking officer in the KGB secret police. And they've propped up the brutal Assad regime in Syria, invaded the Ukraine, promoted extremist right-wing parties throughout Europe, and I've even heard they were involved in meddling in our elections. Oh, and remember that Arsenal for Democracy plan? Well, thanks to the Cold War, it never really ended. In fact, it accelerated. America has maintained its weapon-based economic focus for over 7 decades, not even dialing it back after the collapse of its enemy, the Soviet Union, in 1991. As of today, the U.S. continues to spend more on its military than the next 7 largest militaries combined, and most of them are allies. Finally, if Moscow had fallen in 1941, it's unclear if the Soviet Union would have collapsed, sought peace with Germany, or continued fighting. But it's very likely that World War II would have lasted years longer. This would have created some very dramatically different alternative futures than the one you and I live in now. And most of those are downright scary. The one thing that everyone agrees on is that the end of World War II was a reason to celebrate. And in post-war America, the Moscow Mule would start to take on the world. I say it's time for happy hour. I want you to have a drink now. Hey, welcome to Happy Hour. I am so thrilled to be here with Laura Newman, the 2018 World Class U.S. Bartender of the Year, and the first woman in the United States to claim that title. She's going to show us how to make a Moscow Mule.
Thanks, David. I'm really excited to be here, and I'm really excited to tell you about a Moscow Mule. So, Moscow Mule is one of those cocktails that's definitely more than the sum of its 4 parts. Simple syrup, lime juice, vodka, and ginger beer. And those 4 ingredients work together to create an incredibly delicious cocktail that's also incredibly easy to make at home.
So the Moscow Mule has an interesting post-war history.
It does. So post-World War II, instant cameras had just been invented by Polaroid. And the creators of this drink wanted to harness this new technology, kind of like Instagram today, to get bartenders super excited about this drink. Alcohol companies hadn't really marketed to bartenders before, but Smirnoff was one of the first companies to really include bartenders in its messaging and to get them to sell the drink to their guests. So what they would do is they would go to different bars, order a Moscow Mule, then take 2 Polaroids of the bartender, one that he or she could take home to their husband or wife, and another that they could show off to their friends. And as people began showing off this awesome technology that they had, commemorating their first Moscow Mule making experience, it became more and more popular as bartenders were all vying to get their mugs on camera.
So tell me what goes in a Moscow Mule.
So we're gonna start off with a 1/2 ounce of simple syrup, and then 3/4 of an ounce of lime juice. And after that, we're gonna move into vodka.
So Laura, tell me more about the history of vodka. It was not really popular at first.
No, it wasn't. So prior to World War II, gin and whiskey were probably the 2 most popular spirits in the United States, and also immediately post-World War II. But after World War II, vodka slowly became more and more popular, not only because these bartenders were encouraging guests to drink it, but because of the fact that it didn't have that same really intense flavor as gin or whiskey. Vodka, in fact, is more or less flavorless, and it's the perfect addition to a cocktail where you really want the ingredients to stand up for themselves, and it's perfect for lengthening and extending really strong flavors. It really lets the purity of your ingredients shine through without creating too much background noise. One popular ad tagline back in the 1950s was that vodka leaves you breathless. Unlike gin or whiskey, after you've had a sip of vodka, most people can't really tell on your breath. So in the case of this Moscow Mule, we're gonna do 1.5 ounces of Smirnoff vodka, and then we're gonna shake it up. And then I'm gonna strain it in.
So you don't need to have a copper mug, but it is kind of pretty.
It is awfully pretty, and I think it's nice to think about your guests and what your drink looks like. Creating a beautiful cocktail really starts with a beautiful vessel as well as a gorgeous garnish. I'm gonna top it off with some ginger beer, and then garnish it with a lime wheel and a piece of candied ginger. So to summarize, it's 1/2 ounce of simple syrup, 3/4 of an ounce of lime juice, 1.5 ounces of Smirnoff vodka, topped off with ginger beer. The Moscow Mule. Cheers.
Ah, my favorite part of the day. That is delightful. Thank you, Laura. I want to thank our Indiegogo contributors for getting us to this point, and I especially want to thank Smirnoff Vodka for sponsoring this episode. And remember to think and drink responsibly. When was the first cocktail invented, you ask? Well, let's go back in time and try to find out. Humans love alcohol and have been imbibing fermented drinks for a long damn time, thousands of years at least. Solid evidence for the first wine goes back 7,000 years. Beer became a thing in the early agricultural settlements. Some ancient folks even created gods of beer, wine, and happy partying to celebrate with. But evidence for distilled spirits and mixed drinks? Well, those only go back a few hundred years. That's because to distill wine or beer into spirits, humans needed to invent a new machine. Written records of the first alembic still come from the golden age of Islam in the 9th century. But there was no written record of any mixed drinks, probably because Islamic law prohibited the drinking of alcohol. This is yet another reason why you don't mix church and state. It was in 1806 when the term cocktail was first recorded in an obscure paper in New York. It defined the cocktail as a stimulating liquor composed of spirits of any kind, sugar, water, and bitters. This later became known to us as the old-fashioned.
Ooh, yum.
Even though the cocktail was first named in 1806, the origins of similar mixed drinks goes back further. Punches came into existence in the 1600s, for instance. In the 1700s, colonial non-Native Americans were imbibing many alcohol-laden mixtures such as juleps, flips, cobblers, and smashes. It took about 60 years for someone to produce the first cocktail book. His name was Jerry Thomas, and his book, A Bartender's Guide, was published in 1862. Many others were making cocktails, but Jerry wrote it all down and codified the history of mixed drinks up to that point. And from there, things really took off. So to recap, yes, the cocktail was first named in 1806, but mixed drinks go back hundreds of years earlier. And today, thanks to a craft cocktail resurgence that started in the late 1980s and really exploded in the 2000s, we all now live in the golden age of the cocktail. I'll drink to that. And remember to think and drink responsibly.